Okay, so this week's work is on the rise of the far right and the kind of subtitle here is why fascism is being mainstreamed. And we're lucky this week to have two guest lecturers to talk about their research that relates to this area. First, we're going to talk to Pam Nyland about her research on young masculinities and right-wing populism. And in the second two parts, we'll be talking to Roger Burrows about some of the philosophies behind the rise of the right. And then we're going to conclude with some discussion on the rise of the super rich through that kind of notion of like who benefits, that kind of key sociological notion of who benefits here. So to begin with, we're going to talk to Pam, who is going to talk about her research on young masculinities and right-wing populism. Pam was my PhD supervisor, who taught me everything I know about sociology. So Pam, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, your research history, and then tell us about your current research on young masculinities in the far right?
Okay, well, thanks, Steve. And I can confirm that everything you say is true. Yeah, I've been a youth sociologist for 30 years, and I work specifically around youth, social class, gender, work, school to work transition, and also youth culture. So they're my main areas of research. I've worked in Australia and also in the Asia Pacific, specifically Fiji, Indonesia, and Vietnam. So I have quite a wide scope, and I've written a couple of books on those topics. I guess what interests me about young people is the way that they sit on the cusp between childhood and adulthood. And I've always valued the kind of two-way perspective that young people have. They both look back to the past when they were children and forward to the future where they're adults. And they have a very dynamic and intriguing kind of mindset about what's behind them in terms of their life course and what lies ahead. So when I had the opportunity to collect data on the far right in Australia, I was intrigued to see what the younger men, the younger cohort under 35 would say. And I'm not a genius at quantitative analysis, but if you read the paper, you'll see that there's quantitative analysis in there. And so we were doing correlations to see what was present. And we found quite some interesting things where the younger cohort of men in our survey were saying quite different things to men who were over 35. The survey had both closed questions, yes, no, and open questions where the respondents, the men, were invited to write things. And most of this paper that's attached to this presentation includes quotes. So it's like a form of qualitative data.
Yep. Okay, so the survey was online. Half the cohort was under 35. Young men primarily were kind of blue collar working class. Most were anti-government, as it says here, and there's a kind of backward looking nostalgia for a particular kind of masculinity going on that seems to attach itself to right-wing politics.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah.
I think one of the things, in another part of the survey, which is not recorded here, the young men in particular were asked to say, who's the biggest role model in life? And for both of them, it was a male relative, an older male relative, usually their dad, sometimes their grandfather, sometimes an uncle or something like that. So, I mean, one of the things that indicates is an attachment to what they perceive, and I have to stress that, they perceive to be the great life that their dads and their uncles and their grandfathers lived. I mean, some of them lived through war, like the Vietnam War and the Second World War, so they weren't exactly the golden days. But nonetheless, the young men tend to see it that way, that there were kind of strict gender roles and men knew what they were doing and women knew what they were doing. And your life went through and you got a job for life.
Yep.
And as Steve's dad did and my dad did, and that had a whole lot of certainties that it guaranteed in life. Yep. And what your life meant, I suppose, in the overall scheme of things.
Yeah, we've looked at notions of detraditionalization and individualization and that kind of stuff throughout the course. So that kind of what's happening here kind of maps onto some of those kind of concepts for sure.
It does.
Yeah. So and here you kind of got a kind of broader, I suppose, social space kind of understanding of the conditions that this is happening in, I suppose, for young people. Again, this will be familiar to people in the course. We've looked at this stuff. The first generations to kind of be inheriting lower standards of living, the rapid upward credentializing of labour markets and precarious work conditions, Yeah, can you tell us a little bit about what this means for your research?
Well, in fact, I do cite the work of Steve and the team in this regard, the increasing precarious nature of work. I guess what Stephen and his team were looking at were a different kind of work cohort. The cohort that I'm looking at here is blue collar work. There's a kind of mythology about that blue collar work, if you want to call it that, or trade work, is secure work, that there's no precarity in it. And this is not the case at all. In fact, the nature of contract to contract, periods without work, periods where young men have to travel, for example, on mining rigs or anything of that kind, and the apprenticeship scheme, which takes a very long time on a low wage, all cut against what I say here in the slide. You know, they're less well off than the generation before them in annual income, employment prospects, and home ownership. And in our data, home ownership, or the prospect of never achieving it, was very important to the young men that we surveyed.
Yeah. And so this kind of correlates to a kind of resentment, I suppose, of current conditions that I suppose then manifest themselves in this kind of reactionary orientation to the world.
Yeah, I mean, as a sociologist, I can see clearly that what the way these young men are positioned is within neoliberal governmentality, which is affecting their lives, the international globalization of labour, so that many of the things that men of Steve's dad's generation or mine did are no longer done. You know, a lot of mining processing is not done on shore anymore, it's offshore. And so much of what this young cohort is experiencing is due to the internationalisation of labour and changes in the Australian labour market, but they don't see it in those terms. They don't seem to have a strong understanding of how they're positioned within what's increasingly an international labour market.
Yeah. So it's important here, I think, too, to kind of be clear that by providing these kind of social conditions of, you know, how these kind of radical right thing kind of rises, it's not kind of justifying or legitimizing it, is it? It's like, you know, we kind of need to understand functionally in that sense, you know, and I'm referring back here to classic sociology, you know, why these kind of things are happening. It's not by kind of explaining them with social reasons, it's not kind of legitimizing the kind of hate or the violence and the racism. It's kind of a way of trying to understand it, isn't it?
It is. And I mean, in terms of who decided that they were going to sign up and do this survey, because we had a very open call for participation, what we attracted was young guys who wanted to complain about something. And really favoured a kind of, and by and large, that meant that they were approximating a kind of right-wing position. The young men who didn't want to complain or were having a great time just didn't bother to sign up. So
I think that's an important distinction. There'll be lots of young working class men that are experiencing these conditions that are like, you know, maybe becoming more interested in social progressive things or the environment and stuff like that. It's not kind of some kind of sociological deterministic thing where this is a guarantee. It's just one way of understanding what's going on.
That's right. In fact, if you look at the voting patterns, we asked these men who answered this survey about their voting patterns, and many of them absolutely would not vote for the Greens and they wouldn't vote for Labor. And yet that's not the pattern if you looked at the last elections.
And it's the pattern of broader young people are kind of looking in that direction.
So this cohort we're looking at here is a particular cohort, and their habitus, I know you all know what that means, habitus is aligned to a particular understanding of the way the world should be for working class men like that, and the world is not shaping up the way they expected it to.
Okay, so let's get into some of the findings. For instance, this one is about sources of information.
Okay, so the problem about Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube is that they are not good sources of news and information. They're great fun and one doesn't condemn them, and they're a good leisure opportunity and people chat on, have a great time. However, to depend upon them as a form of news or information that's accurate information, as we found out in the pandemic, it is very dubious indeed. And yet that's where the majority of their news comes from. And even young men, they have the radio on. They, you know, anecdotally in some of the things they wrote, they have the radio on at work, but they make sure they never listen to anything factual. It's got hits of the 60s or 70s on, or depending.
And so there's a bunch of, you know, writing about this in terms of our colleagues in media and digital studies and things like filter bubbles and all that kind of stuff that kind of helpful to understanding this thing. But essentially, the point here is that a lot of the information that these young men are accessing is, you know, biased or not factual, you know, and often produced by particular political means for particular political ends. Yeah.
Yes, it is. I mean, the point there that I make on this particular slide is that for the most part, what's posted to Facebook and Instagram and the kind of things that often that people post to YouTube are not their own original contributions. They're postings from far more radical sources. And the radical sources, that's one of the ways that Gab, Telegram, Discord, and a whole lot of other unregulated social media platforms that promulgate right-wing thinking, their extreme postings find their way into Facebook and Instagram through individuals choosing to repost them and other people responding and posting them on.
Okay, so we mentioned the kind of notion of masculinity here as well, and there's a kind of very particular kind of traditional hegemonic masculinity that is promoted by your respondents. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, I mean, this is once again a kind of idea. I've written another paper, which I've just finished, about true blue masculinity and the way it continues to resonate down through the generations. So these young men say they're missing that. And masculinity, mateship, and hard work. I think that first quote in that slide really says it. That masculinity inheres in these are not awful men. They're men you could probably rely on as a bloke in a crisis to stand up and have your back. So it's not condemning these ideas. Many of these ideas are very positive ideas about men supporting each other and having a good time together. We leave out to be a man, you need a dick. That's about it. But that's a very kind of particular kind of viewpoint. But the idea of a true blue Australian man is completely faded is probably the one that's the dead giveaway, especially in a rural area, which is where the person who said that comes from.
Yeah. So, yeah, very traditional notions of masculinity and like a kind of promotion of traditional gender roles is the way things should be to kind of be efficient, to be kind of for how things should work, I suppose, is the key takeaway from that. Yeah. So it also relates to this kind of notion that we're talking about in terms of looking backwards and the kind of feeling of victimhood by these young, white males.
Yeah, well, one of the things that's occurred to me since I've been writing more on this stuff, since this paper was published, is that white male victimhood flips over into white male herohood. In fact, the victim position is a narrative of redemption, where the victim becomes the hero. And you certainly saw that in the attack on the Capitol in the US, that, we are now the heroes. We are now the ones who stand in the front of everything. So the discourse of white male victimhood is not just an endless self-pitying spiral. It might be for some of them, but it carries within it the seeds of a discourse of the hero, of someone who will step up and reverse that idea.
And the hero is like a key figure in, Connell's work on hegemonic masculinity, right?
Hegemonic masculinity. But the flip between the victim and the hero is actually the hinge or the cusp of right-wing, either symbolic violence or actual violence.
That's go on, sorry.
I was going to say that's the kind of nubbly bit, the node of where an intervention by the far right can be really effective in galvanizing that idea of the reversal of the victimhood.
Yeah, and I think that these quotes relate very closely to Paul Gilroy's work on kind of the what is a post-colonial melancholy. There's a kind of, again, this people that are generally been used to kind of having their own way and kind of the world kind of working for them, as everyone's becoming more precarious and as kind of previously marginalized groups are getting more rights, those previously dominant groups kind of are looking to the past with kind of nostalgia to say things were better back then. But like, as you kind of point out, like probably better if you were a white male, but even a lot of those white males were like, having all kinds of social problems themselves. There's kind of this weirdly misplaced rose-tinted nostalgia to the past that doesn't actually have a real representation of what the past was like in many ways as well. So I think that's definitely a kind of interesting way to think about this as well.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, Steve, you and I know we've swapped stories about how our dads chose never to talk about anything. I'm all right, mate, nothing wrong with me.
Yeah.
I mean, in some ways, the kind of legacy of that as it comes down is that there wasn't anything wrong with them. But in fact, there was a lot wrong, but it never got talked about. So I think what we're seeing is men finding more freedom to talk about what's wrong, but it's manifesting as this kind of nostalgia for the past when nothing was wrong.
Yep.
If you're there.
Yep. Okay, I think we've kind of moved through that one as well. We kind of talked about that. So what's going on with the politics of this stuff, and how does it relate to?
Well, one of the things that we put in the survey was the statement, do you agree or strongly agree, disagree? I support Australian democracy. Now, we had nearly 100% agreement on that. And we thought, that's interesting. And then we kind of looked at the fact that there was a new far-right anti-immigration party called Reignite Democracy Australia. And we became aware of the kind of capture of the concept of democracy by the far right, that we are the true democrats, that we are the sovereign citizens, and the extent to which that overlaps. The other thing is the proxy for I support the Australian way of life, which is better than anybody else in the world, and we have this great thing called democracy. The second highest agreement with a statement, the government should protect working class men. They feel the government doesn't look after their interests, that every time the government gives in, as they see it, to some lobby group or another that is not white male working class men, that it represents something that's being taken away from them.
Yeah. Okay. So how does this relate to notions of class of work and work more generally, in terms of what they had to say to you?
Well, they're kind of right that traditional blue collar jobs are disappearing, but blue collar jobs are not, as such, are not disappearing. Two of the things that are happening is that Australia is solving some of its blue-collar labour market problems by importing labour, especially from the Pacific, for the most basic level of blue-collar labour.
Yep.
As it's always been the case that as men get older and they have no particular qualifications that are transportable or which are commensurate with new technical kinds of needs, that they're less likely to find themselves employed. I mean, I don't know if anyone who's listening to this has employed a tradesperson lately, but they keep showing up at my house well-dressed with little clipboards and earphones on. I mean, it's not the traditional idea of the tradie anymore. So to some extent, traditional blue-collar jobs are disappearing, but they're not necessarily completely disappearing. They reflect perhaps a lack of willingness to kind of step up and do a bit. I mean, training is a very vexed issue, but there are jobs that men who work in, well, my nephew's a roof tiler and he's just upgraded a whole heap of skills in order to work at a higher, more managerial level, for example.
So the other thing that's happening too in the labour market is that, Australia, I suppose, doesn't make as much stuff anymore. And this kind of, again, attaches itself to those kind of things where in the past we used to make cars and all this and make iron and all this kind of stuff. So in terms of those traditional blue collar roles, the working class roles have become kind of a little bit more kind of white collar jobs in the sense of call centers and all that kind of stuff. That kind of part of the class system now is largely kind of service, hospitality, and that kind of so-called unskilled work isn't necessarily making stuff or building stuff or digging stuff anymore. It's more about these kind of more lower paid office jobs.
It is that. And but strangely enough, the cohort that we attracted to this survey were more standard blue collar work. And they were kind of deploring the fact of what you just said.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Like, it's one of those kind of things that people are kind of wishing, the past was better. Yeah. So, okay, to sum up, so tell us more generally about your findings and what you think about all this.
Well, I guess in terms of mental health, one of the things that was quite disturbing, we used the K to 10, which is the standard measure of depression in the survey, that the men and even the young men had quite high levels of stress and frustration and depression. And I guess they were the ones, as I said before, who chose to answer the survey. And I think, once again, when the far right does what they call breadcrumbing, which is leading people by morsel towards a far right position, that they really exploit and take advantage of mental health conditions, insecurity, and feelings of aggrieved entitlement, which is a term I use throughout the paper, which is a theoretical term about privilege.
And it seems like at the same time that this is happening in kind of, for the people you speak to, the kind of everyday people, our political discourse has shifted to the right as well, hasn't it?
Yes, it has. I mean, I'm really quite shocked at the fact that some of the political forces in Australia are actually articulating some quite extreme right-wing
Yep.
views. Whether that represents the voting of the Australian population, given the current governments in nearly all the states and the federal government,
Yep.
and the increase in Green support and the Teal independence, I don't know. But obviously there's cause for concern that many of those extreme far-right ideas are becoming mainstreamed.
Yep. Yep. And I suppose, again, to sum up, like, delusion with government and mainstream political parties is common across the political spectrum. And again, it's to point out that, we're not legitimizing, what's essentially abhorrent behavior by many of the people in these groups, but we're trying to get an understanding of, I suppose, the rise of this and the way that relates to kind of the broader mainstream values that seem to mean that what's called the Overton window of what's acceptable to say in public discourse has shifted to the right along with this. And it seems like many of our political class are trying to actually exploit some of these feelings and in their own way as well. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's true. I just want to say something finally about that, which is the extreme views that some of the men came up with in our survey that they wrote down are not their views. They didn't invent them. They're getting them from somewhere else. And the expression of them, I see, is a kind of a compensatory gesture towards what they feel to be the lack of cultural capital.
Yep. Okay, thanks, Pam. I'll leave it there. I'll stop the recording.
Okay.
Thanks again.
Thank you, Steve.